Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the Florida Springs Council for our latest webinar. I'm really excited about tonight's webinar. We are going to be talking about the ongoing drought in the state of Florida, specifically looking at the impact on threatened species, manatees, and Gulf sturgeon. We have some of my absolute favorite experts on tonight to talk about these species, and I think it'll be a great webinar. Thank you all very much for joining us. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or chat. This is streaming live on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put them in the comments or chat section, and we will get to them after the presentations. The whole webinar will be available on YouTube tomorrow. So if you enjoy this, please feel free to share it with any of your contacts and help us spread the word about the impacts of the ongoing drought on these important species. For a little bit of a refresher on why we have low flow in springs, not only during the drought, but all year round, you can go back on YouTube and watch our Springs Advocacy 101 video from last year. Why is flow declining in Florida Springs? That's going to talk about consumptive use permitting, minimum flows and levels, all of the many reasons why Florida Springs flow are declining and why we're seeing such tremendous impacts during this current drought. So let's dive into the drought a little bit. I'm sure anyone who's been out on a spring or river or seen a lake in Florida over the last 6 months is aware that there is a drought. There is currently 75% of Florida is in drought conditions, and almost 55% is in severe or extreme drought conditions. And if you look at the map there, you can see that big red blaze of extreme drought conditions that basically goes straight across the Santa Fe and Suwannee rivers. The Santa Fe and Suwannee rivers are the home to more outstanding Florida springs than any other rivers in Florida, and the home to more first magnitude springs than any other rivers on earth. And you can see that the drought is really affecting those areas specifically, and that is a lot of what we're going to be focusing on today. Those rivers are experiencing record low flows that are annihilating ecosystems and harming threatened species across Central and North Florida. So what can you do? Every water management district except South Florida, which is kind of getting off easy in the current drought, has special restrictions for the water shortages. As you can see, Northwest is in phase 1, Suwannee is in phase 2, and both St. John's and Southwest are in phase 3, which are extreme drought shortages. Definitely know your local codes. You'll not only find these water management district restrictions, but you also may find more restrictive local regulations. So it's really important to know what your local watering rules are. We can't fix the drought without systemic change, but we all need to do our part. And if you're ever going to narc on your neighbor for watering outside of the time, this is the time to do it, because there's really no excuse to be pumping water out of our springs right now to be feeding our lawns. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker, Tiare Fridrich with Save the Manatee Club. Tiare is a marine biologist. Her work focuses on protecting imperiled manatees and their aquatic habitat for future generations. She promotes enhanced manatee protections across all levels of government, leveraging research to inform conservation strategies and management decisions, and collaborates statewide with stakeholders to address conservation gaps. Tiare received her BS in marine biology from the University of Rhode Island and MPS in tropical marine ecosystem management from the University of Miami. And TJ is going to tell us all about manatees and how manatees are being affected by the current drought. And I was very lucky to go out paddling with TJ on Sunday to go see one of those spots where manatees are being impacted at the confluence to the Ichetucknee and Santa Fe rivers. So it's a pleasure to have you, TJ. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a topic that I'm actually very personally interested in. I live up near the Santa Fe and Suwannee rivers, so I'm seeing the drought for myself, and I'm excited to get to talk to you all about this today. I don't have control of when the slides move, so I'm going to be saying next, and sorry if it's a little bit, wonky, but we're working through it. So next, please. Okay, great. So just a little bit about Save the Manatee Club. I am their manatee biologist. We are a nonprofit established in 1981 by Bob Graham and Jimmy Buffett. And our mission is to protect manatees and their aquatic habitat for future generations. This is a really, really wide mission that has a lot of different levels underneath it. Some of the things that we do are increasing public awareness and education, like giving talks like this one, funding research, rescue, rehab, and release of manatees, advocating for stronger protection measures for manatees, like improved boating zones, and we support efforts internationally to protect manatees in the Caribbean, South America, and in West Africa. Next, please. Oh, one back. Okay. So what is a Florida manatee? Manatees are large, slow-moving aquatic mammals. They live in both freshwater and saltwater habitats. And because they are mammals, they're warm-blooded, they breathe air, they give live birth, and they nurse their young, and they have hair all over their bodies. Every hair on their body is a sensory hair called vibrissae, and they use these hairs to investigate dimly lit environments and feel water currents. The Florida manatee is a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, endemic to Florida. They are generalist herbivores, so they eat over 60 species of aquatic plants, but the majority of their diet does come from seagrass and eelgrass or freshwater grasses. The strongest social bond in the manatee world is between a mom and calf. The calf will stay with their mom for up to 2 years, and during that time, they learn all of the different locations that their mother goes to. They get weaned from milk onto plants, and eventually after those 2 years they will separate and go about their lives, and they are protected federally and statewide. Next, please. So where do manatees live in Florida? Essentially anywhere that you can get a boat from the coast inland, you'll find manatees. There are a few areas in the state where we have historic dams. We've restricted flow and manatees are no longer able to get there, like the Rainbow River. But otherwise, manatees go really, really far inland. They'll go all the way down the St. Johns River and over to Silver Springs, or even into some of our lakes inland, which a lot of people are surprised by. And it's really common for manatees to move between springs, freshwater habitat, and coastal habitat, and to see them in the springs with barnacles on them. So after they've come from an estuary somewhere salt, they'll come into the springs, and those barnacles will actually fall off and sink to the bottom of the springs. But we do see them in rivers, bays and estuaries, canals, and springs all throughout the state. Next, please. Here in Florida, manatees are at the northernmost edge of their winter range. So for other species of manatees, there are 3. Their range is around the equator. So they're actually adapted for the tropics. Despite their rotund shape, they actually don't have as much body fat as you would expect, like other marine mammals that use blubber to stay warm. Manatees here in Florida actually have to go to the springs or other warm water habitat to stay warm. And throughout the rest of their range, typically manatees are restricted by the access to fresh water and not by temperature. And when we think about manatees in Florida and we think about managing them as a species, we separate them into 4 different management units: the Northwest, the Southwest, the Upper St. Johns, and the Atlantic region. Next, please. So you've probably heard that manatees migrate, and we say this because in the wintertime, manatees gather at warm water sites all throughout the state, and they are restricted at those locations in the wintertime. And that is because, like I said, they are adapted for the tropics. So they have trouble maintaining their own internal body temperature when the water temperature drops below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And when manatees are exposed to this water at 68 degrees or below for long periods of time, they can get cold stress syndrome. So this manatee on the bottom right is a picture of a manatee that has cold stress. This is actually not the most severe case, but it's really common for them to get white lesions on their body. They become lethargic, they lose weight because they're not really moving out of that the cold water and into warm water where they need to go to survive. So manatees have to go to warm water sites in the winter in order to survive these colder temperatures. And they have high site fidelity, meaning that they'll go back to the same warm water sites year after year. And part of that is because manatees will teach their calves about those warm water sites, and those calves will then go on to go to those same sites as well. And so some manatees will travel really, really far in the summertime, and other manatees will have a very restricted area, and that's just depending on animal to animal. But when the water warms up, manatees will disperse throughout Florida, and then they'll even go into other states. But not every animal does this, so it really is dependent on the animal. Next, please. This is a map of the warm water refuges, or warm water refugia as we call them, in the state. And you'll see that we have springs, power plants, and canals. Natural springs are a really, really important part of the manatee warm water network, but we know that 66% of manatees in Florida depend upon artificial sources of warm water, like power plants, to survive the winter, because over time we have reduced access to springs, or we've changed where they go fundamentally by the creation of power plants, which is something I could talk about at length for another hour, another time. Next, please. So what are some ways that manatees are impacted by drought? Next, please. So because manatees depend upon the springs year-round for food, water, shelter, as calving grounds, it's really common for manatees to go to a sheltered, safe place to give birth, and in the wintertime for warmth, springs are incredibly important to their survival. When we're in a drought, we have less water in our aquifer, and then we have reduced spring complex and their river flow. And in the case where manatees are trying to huddle into a spring to stay warm, when we have reduced flow, there's less space in the water for manatees to rest. So it has a reduced thermal capacity or space for manatees. There's also longer residence time, so the amount of time that a nutrient will stay in a water body. Without that increased flow, sometimes the nutrients coming from runoff will stay in an area which can feed an algal bloom, which can then smother grasses. I know a lot of us have been to the springs and seen areas that were once very healthy with lush grasses completely smothered by algae. Lower water levels also means restricted access to springs. In some cases, manatees can't actually get into the spring when the water level is low. Manatees prefer to go into areas when they're at least 4 feet deep. So at a certain point, a manatee will see an area and decide that they're not going to try to get in there because they really don't want to get stuck. And then at lower water levels, there's also less space for manatees to avoid boats if they're in a shallow river system, versus having 5 or 6 extra feet of space between them and a boat when they're traveling on the bottom. Now they're more likely to interact with a boat or potentially be struck by a boat because there is less space for them to travel. Next, please. So I wanted to talk about the Florida Springs Heartland region, which is close to where I live and close to my heart. You can see on the map on the left that there's actually quite a lot of seagrass out in the bay, in the Gulf, along the shoreline, and a lot of these coastal springs feed these rivers, which then flow out into the Gulf. And so this is an area of the state, the Panhandle, the Big Bend region, where we're seeing more manatees than we have in the past, and some of the healthiest grasses in the state are growing out in this area. And you can see on the right-hand side from the Florida Springs Institute how many springs we have along the Suwannee and Santa Fe rivers. It is a lot, the most in the state. And I'm going to point out a specific spring here. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the difference between the Little River Springs at high water and what it looks like now. So you can see how reduced that spring flow has become. And at the lower end of the river, it looks like there are rapids there, something that a manatee would not be willing to cross. Next, please. So we're going to look at the Ichetucknee for a little bit. So this is an area, the Ichetucknee River, where we have partnered with with the Alachua County Environmental Department to collect more manatee sightings. We have a manatee sighting form online that members of the public can use to submit their sightings anywhere in the state. And through partnering with the county, we have gotten an influx of sightings from the Ichetucknee, an area where was once believed to not have a lot of manatees, but we're seeing them regularly almost the entire year, except for now when there's a drought. And the reason for this is because the water level is so low, as Ryan said, at the confluence, that a manatee cannot access the river. And there are other locations along the river as well that are berms or has a lot of sediment that even at midwater, manatees can't cross. But something that we're always keeping our eye on here is, are there springs that have restricted access because of human interference, like putting in a sand beach upriver or development that it has eroded the shoreline? In some areas, we can actually, propose restoration projects for those springs to improve access, and that's something that FWC works on. But this spring, as I got out there to see, has a lot of natural karst limestone feature, hard rock, that isn't something that has been altered by us. It's just that the water level is currently so low that manatees just cannot access it. Next slide. And on the left here, you can see what it looks like at high water and what it currently looks like now. And I've never seen the river this low. I'm sure a lot of people haven't. And, you know, it's really important to me that we understand all the different ways that drought may impact manatee access to these systems. Right now in the summer, manatees can go lots of other places, but if we don't get enough rain in the wintertime, manatees may still not be able to access the upper portions of the river because the water level is low. And in that case, we'll be wondering, well, where else are they going, and keeping an eye out for them. Next, please. So how is drought impacting coastal habitats? Next slide, please. So in some Florida estuaries, seagrasses are actually doing really well. And it really depends on how the hydrology of an area, or how it essentially evolved to be over time. In the Indian River Lagoon, there has been in the past a significant die-off of seagrasses from 2010 to 2019. The Indian River Lagoon as a whole lost over 40,000 acres of seagrass. And in 2022-ish, the grasses in the Mosquito Lagoon started coming back really, really lush. And the thought there is that there was a seed bank potentially hidden underneath the sediment that, once conditions were right, where there wasn't as much runoff from rain, that the seagrasses were able to then grow in this habitat that had lost seagrass for a very long time. The Indian River Lagoon is more saline than other estuaries and can tolerate higher levels of salinity. So when there's a lot of freshwater runoff in the lagoon, which just sits there, it actually causes seagrasses to die. So on the other hand, in Florida Bay has existed with sheet flow over the Everglades, which is a very slow movement of freshwater over the Everglades, entering the bay. And the seagrasses are used to a certain level of salinity, but the hot temperatures and the reduction in fresh water reaching the bay has actually caused seagrasses to die off en masse before. In 2015, there was a significant die-off. So not all habitats react the same way to drought, which is why it's important that scientists are out there collecting data so we can understand how these different systems are impacted by drought. And this, not just seagrasses as well, but also other aquatic plants living along the shoreline are impacted by drought as well. If the water levels aren't as high, then some plants like mangroves that need water to survive might also begin to die off. Next. And that was my quick little overview of how manatees are being impacted by drought. I'd be happy to take any questions now or at the end of the presentation. You're muted, Ryan.
There we go. Thank you. That was awesome. So I know it's a little bit of a hypothetical, which you probably don't like, but you mentioned, what if the drought were to continue into the winter months? Just briefly, can you, we all hope that doesn't happen, but if it does happen, can you kind of talk about what you as a biologist might expect to see from manatee behaviors and what some of the negative impacts of that could be?
So what I would expect is there would be manatees that would travel up, say the drought continues and the water level doesn't return to a point where manatees can access the river at all. I would expect that there would be manatees that would travel up the river and would sit at the confluence and try to see if they could make it up the river. And some of them would figure out that they can't go there, and others might not. And we might end up seeing some animals needing to be rescued because they are not accessing warm water in a timely manner. There was a study that showed that when one of the power plants was turned offline, it took manatees about a full year and a half, so a winter cycle and a half, to really figure out that the power plant was off and they needed to go somewhere else. Some manatees figured it out right away and others didn't. And that is, what happens in the wild, that there's some resilience that some animals have and some don't. But when it is a human caused issue, then it's something that we are responsible for fixing. So it would be something where if we know that manatees can't access some of these springs, And there are animals that are going back winter after winter that we would want FWC biologists or park biologists to be aware and keep an eye out for those animals potentially moving into other springs to check their body condition. I know that Alachua County has been working on having winter surveys where they have staff go out with volunteers. The park staff are usually really great at recording if they've seen manatees, members of the public as well. But something, to keep in mind, there's also other, the Weeki estuary, for example, has really, really dramatic tidal fluctuation in the wintertime, and at really, really low water levels, it's really difficult to access the river. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is some restriction access there as well. And we definitely see manatees resting at Hospital Hole in the winter there. So I think it's going to be, if that is what happens, it's going to be everybody being aware that there might be some animals out there who aren't really sure where to go, and keeping an eye out for those animals that might have cold stress and need to be rescued. But these springs aren't the most accessed, but that doesn't mean that there aren't animals who don't depend on it and want to go there every single winter and will wait if they can't get in, to their detriment.
Right, because overall, I don't know if you know this, but do we have any idea how many manatees go up into the Suwannee and Santa Fe each winter?
We don't.
For the warm water?
We don't, and we've only been collecting this data for a few years, but there hasn't been a big tracking effort or anything like that. And it can be difficult, especially in areas where the water is turbid. I mean, if they're in the river, but they're not in spring-fed part of the river, they can be very difficult to see. And honestly, in the manatee world, a lot of things are kind of a hypothetical, because it is so difficult, even when you do an aerial survey, to know the exact number, right? And so then they use models. And so, but we know what behaviors they're going to do. And that is how a lot of our management is based, is we know where they're going to go. And if they don't go there, we know where they might go next. And we're just trying to, see what they're doing. But I think it's really important that we're aware that there are some areas manatees might not be able to access. And something I might be concerned about personally is if there are people at the confluence who see a lot of manatees waiting there in the winter, are they going to potentially harass those animals that are there? Because it happens in other areas of the state, especially if the water is shallow. That would definitely encourage a manatee to leave an area and go somewhere else. But, we don't want any of these animals to be harassed during a time when they're already vulnerable due to cold stress.
Absolutely. Great answer. And one more question on just general big picture. Jessica Meinhofer asks, what can we do to help manatees? Like, what can the average folks do to help our manatee friends?
So I recommend, I don't have the number off the top of my head at the moment, but I recommend having the FWC wildlife hotline number in your phone, and we can pull that up and make sure it's available for all of you. And feeling like if you see a manatee and you're concerned about them, you're like, I don't really know that much about their behavior, but that doesn't seem right, please call FWC. I mean, manatees can't speak for themselves. So it's really important that we advocate for them and let the biologists who are out there know that there is potentially something to be concerned about. When you call FWC for the wildlife hotline, it'll send you to dispatch, and then a biologist will call you back. And it's really important in the age of spam calls that you pick up an unknown number after you've called the wildlife biologists, because it will be an unknown number. And they have told me that one of the most difficult things is that people don't pick up that phone call that's coming back. So please, be aware of that if you're calling. Also, submitting your sightings to our manatee sighting form is very helpful. It gives us an idea, like right now, we haven't seen any sightings in the river for weeks. And that makes us wonder, well, why not? And we can reach out and kind of see what's going on in an area. We've partnered with the Turkey Creek Sanctuary on the other coast to get more sightings, to essentially prove that manatees are using the habitat, and then potentially get more funding for restoration and habitat enhancement. So being aware that manatees are out there, being involved in reporting their sightings, and also if you're out there on a boat, a paddleboard, anything, always giving manatees their space and never trying to touch wildlife or chase after manatees are things you can do to help them.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Please stick around till the end and we'll have more questions. Fantastic presentation, TJ.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. All right, next up, we are going to talk about Gulf sturgeon in the Suwannee River. Very happy to introduce our three panelists for this presentation. Dr. Ken Sulak is a research fish biologist retired from the U.S. Geological Survey. Dr. Sulak has a PhD and master's degrees from the University of Miami School of Marine Science and a bachelor's degree from Harvard University. Dr. Sulak has published extensively on marine fish community ecology and sturgeon life history and conservation. His Gulf sturgeon research filled critical gaps in knowledge of life history, population, biology, and habitat requirements in coastal rivers and the Gulf of Mexico, facilitating conservation of the species. He is a founding member of the North American Sturgeon and Paddlefish Society, and in 2008 was honored with the Gibbs Foundation McAllister Award for Excellence in Marine Fish Conservation Research. He's one of the leading experts, if not the leading expert in the whole world on Gulf sturgeon. Really, really happy to have Ken Sulak here with us. Thanks for being here, Dr. Sulak. All right, and also we have Christian Ard and Chris Getlinger, who are the Itch Boys, Silent Sports. They are amazing content creators. You can find their really amazing videos on sturgeon and many other things on YouTube. They recently spent 8 weeks with Ken diving a 500-acre pool in the Suwannee River where several hundred sturgeon were stranded during drought conditions. I have a real fascination with sturgeon, so I can't wait to see this, but the videos and pictures that they were able to capture are like nothing I've ever seen. So we're going to get to see some of those today while you learn about the sturgeon and how the drought is impacting these incredible fish. And with that, please take it away, guys.
Okay, I guess I'll provide the context and talk about sturgeon in general. They're less well known than manatees, so we need to talk about their requirements. Sturgeon are really ancient fishes that evolved over 200 million years ago. They survived the two great extinctions, and they've changed very little over time. Indeed, they're the slowest evolving vertebrates in terms of DNA change, but that may be a good thing because once you've got a model that will survive 200 million years, you don't need to change very much. There are 26 species of living sturgeons, although 3 may be extinct now. They were the dominant large fishes in every river in the northern hemisphere until we started commercial netting and built dams that got in their way. They're fundamentally freshwater fishes, but some have adapted to a part-time residence in marine waters, and going back and forth like that is called anadromy. It's an adaptation that enables freshwater fishes to take advantage of a much greater food supply in estuaries and in the ocean. And the Gulf sturgeon indeed is an anadromous sturgeon, which feeds intensively on very small invertebrates living in the sediment in Swanee Sound and in the Gulf and in 6 other Gulf rivers. They're out there from November to March, and they can increase their body weight by 50% or more while they feed continuously when they're in offshore waters. Then they home back into the Suwannee River in March and April. The adult males and ripe females head up to the spawning grounds, 200 kilometers upstream to small areas of gravel beds to spawn. Juveniles and females that aren't ready remain in the lower and middle river below Brantford. And it takes 3 years for a female to mature a batch of eggs. So only 1/3 of the adults will be ready in any given years. The BB-sized eggs are black, highly adhesive, and deposited directly onto clean gravel and will hatch out in 3 days. That gravel has a certain size between, say, golf ball size to softball size. The females are very selective. They avoid mud, sand, and large boulders, and they're very particular about getting gravel that's of the right size. And that's important because the hatchling larvae will drop down between the gravel where they're protected from predators. What's important for them Why do they go 200 kilometers upriver? Well, they need particular water characteristics. They need water that's very clean. The pH is near neutral. The lower Swanee is acidic. The upper is alkaline. The upper Swanee is acidic. A certain concentration of calcium ions is necessary for the eggs and sperm to function right. The dissolved oxygen must be high, so you need to be up where the water is rapid and turbulent, and it needs to provide oxygen for the eggs and remove waste carbon dioxide. The females will not use gravel, even if it's there, if the flow is not turbulent. And so they swim up far upriver to find these gravel beds where the conditions are right for the gametes, the sperm and eggs, and the developing eggs and hatching larvae. So when those eggs hatch in 3 to 4 days, almost all of them will get eaten by something else, by fishes or aquatic insect larvae. And that's okay, because that's a transfer of marine energy into the rather energy poor Swanee River, and it presents important food for a large number of fishes and invertebrates that feed on those eggs. Gravel, like I said, becomes important for the hatchling larvae. They'll hide and rest for about 6 days, lying on their side and vibrating to keep oxygen flowing. And while they digest their egg sac, then they'll become free living and free swimming and can feed on their own. The adults, after they spawn, drop down to the lower or middle river, where they'll reside for several months below the main river current in deep scour holes. There are about 6 main holding areas in the entire Swanee River. Each is about a half mile to a mile long, and prominent ones include the area below Manatee Springs, below Fanning Springs, below Old Town Trestle, from Hart Springs to Sun Springs, below Rock Bluff Bridge, and below Anderson Spring. The springs aren't necessarily important in a current context, but they were important in terms of providing those deep holes by the outflow of the spring scouring a hole into the riverbed. The sturgeon rarely move out of these holes once they're in them, and only rarely are they found in between those resting areas in the summer. So let's look at the first slide here. So this is the schematic of a holding area. So you have the mid-depth river, and then you have what's called a run, which is a little bit deeper, and then a hole. And so in that hole, the currents will be reduced, and there'll be a lot of eddies, and the sturgeon can hang out there without spending much energy. They're not going to have to swim against the current. And since they do not feed the whole time while they're in the river, this is important for them to conserve energy. They're also basically freshwater fishes. When they're out in the Gulf feeding, they gain a lot of weight, but they lose a lot of energy trying to get rid of salt continuously, just like our bodies do when we go and spend too much time at the beach. Except for the first year hatchlings, like I said, these sturgeon do not feed at all while they're in the river. And the reason is that tannic rivers and muddy rivers that they live in are very poor in living plankton and in little invertebrates in the sediment. So it's not worth the energy of foraging in order to get the tiny return in terms of food. So during the summer, the adults will lose up to 20% or more of their body weight while they're digesting stored fat and muscle tissue. They have a lot of muscle tissue. These are big fishes that can weigh up to 200 pounds. So they can afford to digest muscle mass and lose a little bit and then restore that when they go back out to feed. Each one of these holding areas will hold several hundred to a few thousand sturgeon packed into this small area. They don't form a school and they don't move around together. They space themselves out. They don't like to be close together, except for an occasional male and female mated pair. Let's see the next slide. These are side scan sonar images. The ones on the left, the Manatee area, off the Manatee Springs. Each one of those shadows on the bottom, and in the case on the right, marked by a yellow dot, is a sturgeon. And I've enlarged one particular area to the left side, which shows a very large female, about 7 feet long, and a male about 6 feet long, that are positioned right together. The animals position themselves about a foot or two off the bottom, where they hover passively while they scull around and rest. And so you'll notice that they're very broadly spaced out from each other, except for this occasional thing. And some of these males and females will stay together for 10 or 15 years. Others don't do this. There's a lot of individual behavior. Also could call your attention to the lower middle of the screen below. This is a side scan sonar that was accidentally tilted forward, and it shows 3 sturgeon hovering over the bottom at the confluence of the Suwannee and Santa Fe rivers. A good illustration of their behavior. And on the right, we have some sturgeon imaged all the way up to the river rise in the Santa Fe River, where they never used to go before until the Santa Fe progressively got darker and darker and darker, because sturgeon do not like clear water. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So sturgeon hover passively above the riverbed, conserving energy, but each one of them jumps once every 2 to 3 days. And that's something that's necessary for them. When they're hovering, they're over the bottom, they're saving energy. But when they lose air from their swim bladder, they have an internal swim bladder that functions like a diver's buoyancy compensator, and it's full of gas, and that enables them to hover over the bottom without spending any energy necessarily to try to swim up or to swim down to stay stable. But the blood system, like our system, absorbs oxygen, and so over a period of 2 to 3 days, they lose 20% of the volume of that swim bladder that they need to replace. And the way they replace it is they breach or jump. And during that jump, you can see the sequence here in a big old sturgeon who was lazy at the end of the summer and didn't want to jump, but just came up, stuck its snout out of the water far enough to open the mouth in the second frame, suck in air into the mouth cavity, then shut the lips tightly, and then splash back down. And all of this takes place in about 1.2 seconds. And so the primary reason that sturgeon jump, or breach as in this case, is to intake a mouthful of air. Okay, you can show the next slide. But nature's opportunistic and clever, and so jumping has evolved into a secondary function that serves the social communication. When that fish, an adult, the juveniles take time to learn how to jump properly, but the adults ascend almost vertically, 6 to 10 feet, and they keep the tail flipping, and that tail flip helps them to twist the body and rotate it so that they end up horizontal, upside down, or on their side, so that when they land back down, they make the biggest splash as possible. And sometimes they also hold the tail a little bit up and smack it on the water when they land to make that even louder. And the graphs down here below show what's going on. If you look at the one on the right, pre-jump, the upper trace, the fish is showing the position of the fish near the bottom, and it's going up and down and up and down and up and down. It's not stable because its buoyancy controlling swim bladder has lost air. It jumps that peak, and then after that it descends, recompresses that air, and that fish is very stable for the next period of time. And so that's what's going on. They jump to both to inhale and reinflate that swim bladder, and they also jump for social communication. Let's continue that. The next slide. Okay, jumping occurs rarely when sturgeon are migrating, and the reason for this is just simply by swimming with that torpedo-shaped body and the flat belly, they generate hydrodynamic lift, just like an airplane does. And so simply by swimming, they can establish the buoyancy that they need to stay off of the bottom. And so their jumping is rare during that period of March and April. And so what we found here is that during the drought, which started in September 2025 and extended through early June, still going on, but in terms of lowering the river, this was the period of significance. You can see right there by the 1st of December, major shoals in the Swanee River were emerging. And that meant that the sturgeon eventually got trapped behind those shoals. They couldn't get further upstream. They needed to go another 80 kilometers to get to the spawning grounds. And the water stayed low at an almost stable level right up until the period of the equinox. And sturgeon don't use their eyes to feed with, but they use their eyes to measure light. And so they know how long day length is, and they're waiting for when the day length is equal to the night length at the spring equinox, and also the water temperature at that time in the Gulf is about 18 to 20 degrees C. And so at that time, with the water temperature about that, they enter the Swanee River, and then they're heading upstream in March and April, that spawning time interval that's indicated there. And this year it so happened that the drought was at its worst right in that time period, right in mid-March. The river went down another foot. And so those shoals were absolute barriers to sturgeon getting upriver. Some early males probably got up to the spawning grounds before that happened. But after that time, for a period of 8 weeks, when Chris and Christian were out looking at these fish underwater, those fish could not get up to spawn at the spawning grounds. And by early June, when we did get the rain cycle start again, and you can see the water level, this is at the gauge at Brantford, which is about 5 miles downstream from where these sturgeon were being observed. By the time the river rose back up to where they could get over the shoals, the water temperature had warmed up to 28 degrees C, which is way, way too warm for spawning. 23 degrees C is the limit of normal development for eggs, embryos, and hatchlings. At temperatures above that, cell division gets all messed up and the fish will die rapidly. So that whole period of time from December through early June, sturgeon were stranded. And they normally, like I say, don't jump when they're migrating, but these sturgeon were jumping intensively in a rather small pool, about 500 acres, at depths that they're not usually comfortable with. They like to be in deeper water and in water that was exceptionally clear for the Swanee. After those several months of no rain, the spring water input dominated the Swanee so that we had something like 10 to 12 feet of visibility, which is remarkable for the Swanee River. And so these fish were stranded in water that was too shallow for them to be comfortable and very uncomfortable because the water was clear. And that probably contributed to the intensive jumping going on because of the stress of that. Next slide. All right, so this is a large female sturgeon that Christian happened to capture by waiting patiently on his paddleboard with his camera on the tripod. And these fellows got some remarkable pictures. You can see that tail flipping and the swirl of water that's created by that. This is the early part of the jump where the fish is ascending vertically. And the reason I say that it's a female, because it has a sunken belly. It's caved in. And what happens is when a female sturgeon is ripe or gravid with eggs, that belly is very expanded and taut like a blimp. And when they shed their eggs, the belly retracts inward, and they actually have down the center, there's a series of stretch marks where the skin is recovering from being expanded. So we know that this fish shed her eggs at the wrong kind of place with no gravel, pure sand bottom, at the wrong temperature, too warm for the eggs. So this is an example of a jumping sturgeon that's showing us that the spawning failed for this year, the spring spawning. Fortunately, sturgeon are animals that have adapted over time. They have a fallback, and that is there are two slightly genetically distinct groups of sturgeon in the Swanee River, and 20% of the adults are actually adapted to spawn in the fall from the period when the temperature falls below 23 degrees C. And once again, is very closely coordinated with the fall equinox. And they can, if the river recovers by then, these 20% of the adults, which will be able to make it up to the spawning grounds and contribute to the species. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next one. What I wanted to show here is that drought does have an impact. We have such droughts like this approximately every 10 to 15 years in the Swanee. We had the most serious one we've ever had was from 2000 to 2001. Historically, there were major droughts back in the 1800s and early 1900s. But in recent time, we had one in 2000, 2001, extending almost to 2002. And again in 2011, all year long into 2012. What we see here on this graph is in 1984, the state put a harvest ban, no more net fishing for sturgeon. And as soon as they did that, if you look at the lower dashed line, the percentage of adults in the population started to increase. The mortality went way down. And if you looked at a population curve, it's the same thing. The percentage of adults is mirrored by the number of fish. And so what we see during the 2000 to 2002 drought, looking at data of marked and recaptured fish, we found that we had a big dip in the population recruitment that in that particular time. So the drought did have an impact then, and we suspect that all such droughts will have an impact. Now let's go back to the previous slide. Okay, so this is a period of the Swanee, a map of the Swanee River. The thing about sturgeon is that they've been around for a long time. They're well adapted to handle lots of different situations. And since the harvest ban, the population, which was down to about 2,000 fish in the whole river, only about 4% of which were adults because the adults were selectively netted out, and almost no recruitment or reproduction of juveniles. Once that harvest ban was put into effect, the population increased quite well after a period, a lag of about 3 years. We're now up to about 15,000 sturgeon in the river. And so the numbers have increased. The other thing is that sturgeon have expanded their range of use in the Swanee River. They've expanded their spawning grounds, the little blue areas, and further up the Swanee River into the upper area below White Springs and into the lower Withlacoochee River up towards Madison Springs and in the Santa Fe River. Now, the Santa Fe River is an interesting story because in the early 1990s, the Santa Fe was essentially crystal clear with lots of vegetation on the bottom. You could kayak up and down there and see the bottom everywhere. And that's when 1994 is when I arrived in Gainesville, and I did a lot of field research to look at habitat at that time. And I was astounded by how remarkably clear the Santa Fe was. You could see all those turtles on the bottom. You could see the fish. And I talked to lots of people, divers, fishermen, residents. No one had ever seen a sturgeon in the Santa Fe River. And the reason is sturgeon do not like clear water. They're secretive animals that like to be down where it's dark and deep. They like the tannic water. The Santa Fe River, unfortunately, has gotten darker and darker and darker, and the vegetation has disappeared as a result. Part of that is a result of brownouts during flooding, but a lot of it is due to increased eutrophication, such that we have lots of microalgae growing in the water column and screening out the sunlight so that it gets darker. And sturgeon are now comfortable in entering the Santa Fe, and they go all the way up to the rise, and they probably spawn around Wilson Springs on gravel beds that are present there. Anyway, that's the story. We had these two remarkable videographer nature observers, Christian and Chris, who, while the river was in this low stage, and you can see here, these are some of the shoals around the Macomb boat ramp. This is above Troy Springs, about 5 miles. Essentially, the river was completely blocked off except for a few chutes that were too fast for sturgeon to want to swim through or too shallow. And this is an example of, this is not the absolute lowest it was, but this is a good example of what they faced. And the next slide. And so what happened is we had this pool of water, and in that pool of water that was relatively clear, we had, my estimate is about 700 sturgeon in this small area. And they were behaving, I'll let Chris and Christian talk about this. They can tell us what they saw. Okay, guys, take it.
Yeah, thank you. Like Ken said, it was interesting for us because it was a period of time when the river was extremely clear for the Suwannee River. Typically, it's not that clear. We just happened to get very lucky to find the fish coming up to spawn in an area that was clear enough to video. So we came across that area by Fort Macomb boat ramp, and we jumped in, and we got very lucky to see the fish. They were kind of getting funneled into an area that we affectionately called the hot gates area. It was a fast moving channel, which made a bit of a challenge to get in there and video the fish because the water was ripping through this channel quite fast. So the fish were having to swim. They weren't just holding up in an area and relaxing. They were actually having to swim, but they were all being funneled into that area. And so, again, because the visibility was good and it was clear, we got in there and we took every advantage that we could to get in there and video them for as long as we could. So we were there for approximately 2 months in not only that channel, but then the pool up river from that was a nice holding area for them where they could swim through the channel and then kind of easy a little bit. So at first, when we got in there, the river conditions were nice because it was very clear. But by the end of the 2 months, when we started to get the rain in June, the conditions deteriorated. Like Ken said, the water temperatures were not conducive for spawning. And recently, they started to move out of those areas. Visibility deteriorated. We weren't able to keep filming them, but we got as much as we could for as long as we could. So.
Yeah, let me interject here something, and that is the imagery that these fellows got is scientifically very valuable because normally the visibility is such it's only about 2 feet. The water is very dark and tannic, extremely difficult to get in and film sturgeon. You can get close to them, and this underwater imagery that they captured showed many things. Right here, this sturgeon you're looking at, the little white tags on the body are leeches. They're parasites. And in some other imagery, you can see that the whole head is covered with another sort of parasite that's similar to a copepod. It's a flattened animal that has a suction disc, and it lives by eating the slime off the fish and some of the skin cells. We also were lucky in that these fellows were able to image fish that had injuries. There was a fish that had obvious prop scar along its side, deep gouges into it. And there were 2 fish that had a big knob at the beginning of the dorsal fin. And that knob is from where that fish had been tagged by the Caribbean Conservation Corps back in the 1980s with a Monel metal cattle tag clipped onto the base of the dorsal fin, which caused that fish to start growing a big callus essentially over that tag. And so this gives us information on just how long some of these fish can live. Normally they live for 25 to 35 years. That means the females will spawn about 3 times in their life. several million eggs. And but we didn't know the absolute thing. So these fish that they were able to image with that knob at the base of the dorsal fin are somewhere in the order of 50 years old, which is probably close to the maximum age for Gulf sturgeon. Okay. Hey, got to get some better looking people.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think she talked about running the video at the end or something. So, or maybe this is question answer time. I'm not sure.
Hopefully we haven't lost Ryan and Chloe.
Yeah, so we're seeing some of that video
Here comes
right now, some of your video on the screen there.
Maybe.
All right, I think that is the video. Very cool. Thank you so much, Ken, Christian.
Oh, let me add one more. Let me add one more comment. I forgot to mention that besides that loud slap down sound, sturgeon produce tongue clicks underwater, 3 clicks in a row separated by 3/5 of a second, and then the big jump and splash, and that's all a patterned signal that tells the other fish, "Hey, I'm here. You guys need to be over here where I am." So, anyways, I just wanted to add that in.
Well, that's great because that actually gets us to one of our questions. Is there a recommended resource to hear sturgeon sounds?
Well, if you're underwater, you can hear them with your human ear. We've recorded the sounds using hydrophones, but you can duplicate them by clicking your own tongue. It's exactly the same sound, clicking your tongue like that, only it's probably much louder underwater for the sturgeon. That splash sound, we've recorded that as much as a mile away, so that travels quite a distance.
I was camping with my daughter near the confluence of the Suwannee and Withlacoochee rivers when she was little, and it was nighttime, and we thought someone was shooting a gun off somewhere in the state forest until we saw a sturgeon jump, and the way it was echoing off of the limestone walls there of the Withlacoochee, it was just absolutely incredible. And she still talks about it to this day.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it brings up sturgeon are for their body size, amongst fishes, they have a relatively large brain. So if the brain is big as a marble or a walnut, which is enormous compared to the brain of a goldfish, for example, and the volume of the brain is what controls how many connections can be made and how much learning can be stored. And sturgeon, over the years of studying them, we've got lots of examples of learning and lots of individual behavior, and they keep surprising us. We had one sturgeon swim way up the Itchitucknee River in 2019, which is something I would have never predicted. A large individual, about 6 feet long, and one of the Florida wildlife FWC biologist was fishing with his kids right where you were talking about at the confluence with the Withlacoochee 2 years ago, and there were Gulf sturgeon spawning against the rock wall in the daylight, in the middle of the day, at the surface, which is exceptional because normally they spawn deep in the middle of the night, 2 to 3 a.m. on the bottom, on gravel. And so they're adaptable in strange ways. They're always experimenting with something new, which may have survival value.
It's amazing. I got one more question for Christian and Chris, and then we're going to bring TJ in and get to the audience questions. Christian and Chris, I mean, you guys were out there all that time. Any just kind of great stories, something that you'll just never forget that you witnessed while you were out there in the water with the sturgeon?
To me, the neatest thing about it was Ken had mentioned to us probably 2 or 3 years ago about us trying to get out and see if we couldn't find a good spot to video sturgeon. And it seemed like an impossible task at the time when he mentioned it to us because, like he mentioned earlier, they usually hold up in a deep hole out by like Manatee Springs, for example. And we're thinking logistically, how can we get out there and film sturgeon in a deep, dark hole? What are we going to need? Are we going to need scuba equipment? Are we going to need lights, a boat to have all of our equipment on? And so the fact that we found them in this area of fast moving water that was incredibly clear, the first time that I dove down and actually saw them down there and was right up close to a 6-foot fish that resembles a shark in a way was amazing. I'm used to diving and breath holding and things like that, but I tell you what, I couldn't hold my breath for 10 seconds and I shot up like a rocket and was so excited to let Chris know that I saw the fish down there. Yeah, I was screaming and sucking air and everything else because I was so excited to see him down there, and I actually caught him on camera. So that was incredible to me to do something that I later found out that very few people have ever done before. Just an amazing experience. And the fact that we could spend 8 weeks out there with these incredible fish, I know it's an experience that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. We originally went out there because we were trying to find the fish because there was a group of photographers for National Geographic that are doing a special a movie on different parts of the Suwannee River, and one of the things that they're highlighting is sturgeon. So we went out there, we found the fish, we got onto them, and we were actually able to video them, and then we could contact some of these other individuals that were interested in filming them as well and put them onto a really good spot. And I think they got a lot of good stuff, a lot of the things that they wanted to capture for the movie that they're putting together as well. So to meet some of these other gentlemen that were interested in this and to get out and experience these fish, swim right alongside them, and spend that much time with them was incredible. Something that I don't think I could explain to someone who's never seen them before. And so to be able to put a video together and try to get as close to them as we could so that other people can experience them the way that we did, it was just like I said, a once in a lifetime thing for us.
It really is amazing. Now we're going to bring back in TJ from Save the Manatee Club. Let me see if I can unmute you, or if you can unmute you.
I got it.
Awesome. All right. And a little wrap up. So if you are not a member of the Florida Springs Council, we do have a free membership, or you're welcome to donate. You can find that on the links there or by scanning the QR code. This webinar will be available on YouTube starting tomorrow. So if you found it as fascinating as I have, please share it on social media, help us spread the word, and get more eyes on this. And with that, we're going to spend a few minutes finishing out with your questions. All right, we're going to start with Jessica. Oh, no, we're not. Go ahead, Chloe. We are starting with a question that came in beforehand. Are there rules during a drought that less water is allowed to be pumped out of the springs so the springs will have a chance to refill and get fuller? This is a good reminder of something I was supposed to announce on the last slide, but we're going to have a follow-up webinar to this one on July 28th, talking about some of the regulatory solutions to the drought. What can our state agencies do and are not doing to try to put more water into our springs and rivers to help these species out? So there are rules that give the water management districts the ability to do things, but right now, outside of those watering restrictions that we put early on in the webinar, there are no additional restrictions on pumping or consumptive use permits, water bottling, or anything like that. All right, next question, Chloe. All right, Ken, are there any sturgeon in the St. John's? I saw some years ago in the Tennessee Aquarium, never in nature.
Yeah. Yeah, there are two species of sturgeon that are native to the east coast of the U.S. Interestingly, they go from the St. John River in New Brunswick, Canada, to the St. Johns River, Florida. And the St. Johns River, Florida, is the lower extreme of the range. And there were lots of sturgeon in those coastal rivers, the Nassau River and the St. Johns. Back in the early 1800s, there was a commercial fishery that landed thousands of pounds a year of sturgeon in the Nassau River and in the St. Mary's River. They were fished down, but there are survivors. We started a program of research over there, and then the University of Georgia took it over, and they indeed found that after the cellulose plant was put out of commission about 20 years ago on the St. Mary's River, a remnant population that was still there has rebounded and is increasing. And every year in the St. John's, a few fishermen catch a specimen of either the Atlantic sturgeon or the short-nosed sturgeon. So they are there. Their problem is they lack a spawning ground. If we got rid of the dam on the Ocklawaha, they could get back up into the Ocklawaha. I've snorkeled a great length of that and found suitable gravel beds that they could spawn on where they probably spawned originally, but cannot get to now because there's a barrier in the way. And that's a problem for sturgeon species worldwide. These dams, if they can't get up to the spawning grounds, they can't reproduce. And that's not only sturgeon, it's, American shad and those two species of sturgeon, and even some freshwater like channel catfish that need to migrate up to Silver Spring and the lake. That's a problem.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the benefits of Ocklawaha restoration that's not talked about enough, is the ability to restore the sturgeon grounds. I was just up at the Sulak National Fishery hatchery up there where they were spawning sturgeon for release in the St. John's, and that was really interesting because I had never heard of them being in the St. John's, but they had thousands of them there ready for release.
They raise striped bass also to release. It's another species that cannot get up to its original spawning grounds.
Yep, and the channel catfish. It was really
Yeah.
interesting. And they had 6 manatees recovering there as well. Cool place. All right, next question, Chloe. All right, what's your favorite fact about sturgeon? I think this one is for you, Ken.
I guess it's that they look ancient, dinosaurish, and dumb, but they are incredibly adaptable and smart. When you capture one of those sturgeon in a net to tag it, you can forget about capturing it again for about 2 or 3 years because it remembers that occasion and it will not get near that net again. And we have lots and lots of information about them learning things. Indeed, there are some in this run up to the spawning grounds. There are always a few juveniles, and Chris and Christian captured images of some of those that go along with the adults. And I speculate that the reason they do is to learn where the spawning grounds are.
Next question. From Ryan Worthington. Yeah, I think, Ken, can you talk about the benefit of the social aspect of sturgeon jumping, if there is one, and is there any territorial aspect to it?
They're not territorial. They don't like to be next to each other. They space each themselves out mutually same distance pretty much between sturgeon when they're in these holding areas. They don't move together. The social aspect is that those holding areas are very important for them to conserve energy during that non-feeding time of the year. And so there's the sound production is important because it's just like cattle out on a grazing area. It's important for those strays to get to where the main herd is, where the good grass is. And so the jumping says, hey, we're over here. If you're somewhere else, this is where you need to be. Come where we're making this sound. And they do a lot of jumping and a lot of clicking underwater when they're in those areas.
Great answer. All right, and our final question is back to TJ for manatees. A little bit off topic, TJ, but if you can, something I've been wondering about too. Can you talk at all about how the recent changes to the federal ESA harm rule might impact manatee protections?
That is a very big and complicated ask. And we're currently working on some write-ups about it. And it's not as much my area of expertise, unfortunately, but I know the rule passed last week, and it would essentially remove the definition of harm from a lot of the ESA protections, and it is not in manatees' best interest or any other wildlife.
Or humans.
Or humans. It is really, really quite terrible. And we are hopefully looking into some bills that are good and going to add some additional protections in other areas that, we can help to support. But as far as like the explicit details of exactly the ways that it'll harm manatees, we're going to have something coming out soon for you guys. But I don't have it at my fingertips today.
That's more than fair. I will say it's going to make it a whole lot harder to protect habitat for any endangered species, which is really the most important thing that we can be doing for most of our endangered species these days, it's not someone shooting them or catching them. We've taken care of a lot of that. It's habitat destruction, and it's going to make preserving that habitat much, much tougher. And with
it's already not easy, especially with manatees crossing so many different, jurisdictional boundaries, and how many different agencies have authority over the different areas they go in. I mean, it's already so incredibly complex on top of everything else.
Hey, Ryan, could I make a comment regarding one of the early chat questions on manatees?
Absolutely.
Somebody asked, what can you do to improve or help protect, conserve manatees? In the Ichituckney, manatees, their primary food, and I've been watching them in there for 30 years, is not seagrass, it's water lettuce. They love water lettuce. And I have really good video that was obtained by another underwater videographer of just a big manatee going up, pulling down a head of lettuce, munching it, going up, getting another, and continuing on doing this, ignoring the seagrass altogether. We unfortunately have in Florida a program of eradication of water lettuce, which is important in places like the St. Johns River. But in spring runs, it's a bad idea, and they enlist volunteers to go out on these lettuce pulls. And one of the worst ones occurs in January, and when the manatees are in there feeding in the wintertime. And so it's really unfortunate that we have this transfer of this policy of removing lettuce to an area where it doesn't need to be removed, and it really helps the manatees.
Wasn't there a study that came out recently that we have an endemic species of water lettuce?
Yes, it's a native species. It's not exotic. It's native. Yes.
And
it's a real problem in canals and reservoirs and still water like the St. John's, but it's not a problem. It doesn't block anybody's paddling or anything in the Ichituckney. And besides being important for manatees, it's important for about 50 other species of fishes and invertebrates. And it's the only habitat that long-nosed gar attach their eggs to. So it's really important.
Good point. Can I know that there's been some really cool research over at FSI on the long-nosed gar, Bill Hawthorne, and other things. So that's awesome for bringing that up. All right, with that, we're going to call it at an hour and 15 minutes. I want to give a big thank you to all of our presenters. You all were awesome. Thank you to everyone who watched and asked questions. Again, please help us share this really fascinating video to learn more about sturgeon and manatee, and keep an eye out. In 2 weeks, we'll be back talking about some of the institutional and regulatory solutions that are available to solve the drought issues while we all do our rain dance. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.